this video, I will show you with very simple instructions how to compile the Linux kernel from source code. For this video, I'll be using a Debian 11 virtual machine and compiling the latest stable kernel, which at the point of the recording of this video is 5.10.14. Modifying the kernel to a specific purpose is beyond the scope of this video. However, I will walk through some of the kernel configurations in the configuration menu, which we will see later on. Now, some of you might be asking, why even bother? Using a self-compiled kernel can be very beneficial, especially if you want to put personalization to the next level. Linux is all about personalization. The kernel can be configured to your special needs and be optimized for your hardware. Since distribution provided, pre-compiled kernels are very generic. Furthermore, the version of the kernel you may want to use may not be in your distro's repo. The only safe way to install it would be to compile it yourself. Now, without further ado, let's get started. First of all, we need to install some dependencies. The dependencies needed to compile the Linux kernel are relatively simple and are included in the repositories of most Linux distros. Here's a list of packages you need to install. Some distributions may have different names for these packages. I recommend consulting the documentation of the distribution first to make sure the dependencies are correct. Now I'll open my terminal and paste in the command. Now press Y to confirm. Now the installation is finished, we can finally start to download the Linux kernel and then compile it. This is the Linux Kernel Archive's official website. In this video, I'll be compiling the 5.14.15 kernel, which is the latest stable release. If you have older hardware, download one of the long-term releases. On the releases section, we can see here a table of the end of life of various kernel versions. For example, the version 4.19 will have an end of life in December of 2024. It is recommended to upgrade your kernel before this end of life, because end of life kernels will no longer receive support and no longer have any security updates. Therefore, it is crucial for a user to upgrade their kernel before its end of life. Let's now head back to the front page of the website and download the Linux kernel. The Linux kernel is now downloaded. Now we need to extract it. As you can see, the tarball is now in our downloads folder. The next step is to extract the files from the tarball. There are multiple ways to extract the tar.gz file. In this video, I'll be showing you the recommended way, which is using the tar command. First, let's open the terminal and cd into the downloads folder. Once in the folder, we can execute tar-xvf to extract the files. X meaning extract, V meaning verbose, and the F flag specifying the file. Let's now enter the command. As you can see here, the files are being extracted. Now the extraction is complete. Before we actually start to compile the kernel, we first need to have a configurations file to tell the kernel which modules to include and disable. For this video, I'll be using a pre-existing config file of my current kernel, which is located in the boot folder of my root directory. Using a cp command, I will copy the configurations file into the .config file of the Linux kernel. The configurations file is successfully copied. I do recommend using this configuration unless you need to enable or disable something special. If that is the case, make sure to do research on their purpose beforehand, for turning off a critical part of the kernel will cause the kernel to malfunction. The recommended way to edit these configurations is through a command called make menu config, which will open up an in-cursive user interface for a user to easily modify these configurations. I will show you how make menu config looks like. This is the in-cursive user interface for make menu config. In here, you can use your keyboard to go around different settings of the Linux kernel. For brevity of this video, I will only go into a few menus and show you what these menus offer for configuration options. Now I will go into networking support. In networking options, there are many different configurations to select. For example, amateur audio, CN bus subsystem, and Bluetooth subsystem, which many disable for security purposes. If you head to networking options, there are many options that will be beneficial for building a server. By pressing escape 2 times, you can return to previous menus. Now let's take a look at device drivers. The device drivers menu contains the drivers to turn on and off for the kernel. These drivers do not need to be installed manually later on, for they are already included in the kernel. For example, we can see here there's PCI Express support, there's plug and play support, parallel port support, and even Macintosh support. Later on, there are specific driver settings for specific hardware. To save and exit, use your arrow key to move to save, and press enter. Press enter again to confirm. Now press escape 2 times to exit the menu. Now we are back at our terminal. Sometimes configuring this can take hours, but for brevity of this video, we are using the pre-existing config and we will not be changing any configurations. Now with our configurations done, we are ready to start compiling. Compiling the kernel can take a very long time, or a very short time, depending on your setup. To make the compilation process faster, you can specify the amount of threads for a compiler to use. The rule of thumb is to pass in the -j flag of make as the number of cores times 2 plus 1. For example, I have allocated 4 cores to this virtual machine, meaning I will pass in -j5. Normally, it is best to compile the kernel on actual hardware for faster disk writing speeds. However, for the purposes of this video, I will be using this virtual machine. I will now type in the command and the compilation process will start.
One eternity later.
But that took a lot of time and it took me 3 tries to have the kernel compile successfully, because some options in the configuration need to be changed in order for the kernel to successfully compile. Here are the options that you should change. Now let's install the kernel with this command. The last thing we need to do now is to reboot. In the grub menu, select the latest kernel. As we are now back in the system, let's open the terminal to check the kernel version. As you can see here, the kernel version is 5.14.15, which means our compile is successful.